Today on CSS Breakdown, book by book, we embark on a journey through the transformative era when distant British colonies evolved into self-governing nations, delving into Chapter 18 of Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, in Season 06, Episode 18. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission, as always, is to, cut through the noise and give you a shortcut to understanding what's often a pretty complex bit of British and global history. So today we're pulling out the key insights and, some genuinely surprising facts from this chapter. We're focusing specifically on the incredible journeys of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand before 1914.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here is seeing how these seemingly separate things happening in different corners of the globe were actually, driven by remarkably similar pressures. Shared ideas, too. This period isn't just some historical footnote. It absolutely laid the groundwork for the modern Commonwealth. And really, the whole concept of independent nations choosing to keep a shared heritage, it's a testament, I think, to a fascinating process of adaptation. On both sides, really. The colonies pushing for more autonomy and the British Empire, maybe sometimes reluctantly, but still decisively evolving.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit then before we dive into the specific countries. What exactly does dominion mean here? Because it sounds like it's, a lot more than just swapping colony for a new name, right?
Yeah.
For a long time, the thinking was just that colonies existed purely for the mother country's benefit.
You're absolutely right. It was a huge shift. The formal name Dominion that was decided at the 1907 Colonial Conference. This new term applied to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and then from 1909, South Africa. Basically all the self-governing parts of the empire. But this evolution started much earlier, really after Britain lost its American colonies in the War of Independence, 1775 to 83. That defeat kind of forced a new reality. The acceptance that European-populated colonies would eventually govern themselves, you couldn't stop it. And a really critical catalyst in changing minds was Lord Durham's report on British North America back in 1839. That report, controversial in its way, but it played a vital role in persuading the British government that embracing self-rule was actually the best way to hold the empire together, not trying to force control.
Okay, so it wasn't like flipping a switch to independence. It sounds more like there were distinct steps, almost like climbing a ladder to self-governance that these colonies followed. Could you walk us through those key stages?
Certainly. Yeah, it typically started with, 1, direct rule. That's where a British governor held all the power, governing with a council he pretty much picked himself. Then stage 2, representative government. You get an elected council, but, and this is crucial, it was only advisory, no real power. The big turning point was 3, responsible government. Now you get an elected assembly that actually had the power to appoint and dismiss ministers.
Yeah.
They controlled internal affairs.
So that's where the real shift in power happens.
Exactly. And finally, 4, federal government. This is where separate colonies or provinces decide to unite into a bigger federation. They keep their own local parliaments, but also join a central federal one. Oh, and it's worth noting, too, the exact meaning of dominion status was actually a bit vague until it got properly defined in 1926. That definition clarified complete freedom from British control, but importantly, kept that link through the monarchy.
Right, so we've set the stage with the whole dominion concept. Now let's turn to Canada. Its journey to self-rule seems, particularly dramatic. Lots of internal friction, plus that constant pressure from the U.S. next door.
Canada's story as a British dominion, it really kicks off with early European settlement. Rival French and British trading companies initially. The French were dominant for a while, but then after their defeat in the 7 Years' War, Canada officially became British with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And that left Britain with this substantial French-speaking population to govern, which turned out to be a persistent challenge, to say the least.
And how did Britain first try to handle governing that large French population? I seem to remember an act specifically about that.
Precisely. Britain came up with the Quebec Act of 1774. It was pragmatic, trying to placate the French. It granted religious freedom to Catholics, recognized French civil law, but crucially, no elected assembly. That was a clear sign Britain was still clinging to centralized control and, maybe unintentionally sowing seeds for future trouble.
And then the American War of Independence shakes things up again, brings in a whole wave of new settlers. How did that affect Britain's next big move? Pitt's Canada Act in 1791.
Oh, it definitely did. The American War brought a huge wave of United Empire loyalists, Americans loyal to Britain, into Canada. They settled mostly inland, Lake Ontario way. This created a whole new demographic picture. Quebec naturally started splitting into a French-speaking east and an English-speaking west. So Pin's Act formally recognized this. It divided Quebec into Upper Canada, mainly English, and Lower Canada, overwhelmingly French. Each got an elected advisory assembly, but the real power, still with British-appointed lieutenant governors. So Canada had representative government, but that responsible government, still decades off.
Sounds like a recipe for serious tension. And sure enough, it led to the rebellions of 1837. What were the main grievances that fueled those uprisings?
Well, in British Upper Canada, there was deep resentment. The lieutenant governor and his council were seen as giving preferential treatment, land, jobs, all to the loyalists. And crucially, these huge tracts of land, the clergy reserves, set aside for the Church of England. That felt really unfair to other groups and settlers desperate for land. Down in French, Lower Canada, the elected assembly was mostly French, but the British governor and his council, they had the final say. This bred suspicion, especially when the British American Land Company started selling land to non-Catholic British immigrants right in French areas. But the major unifying demand in both provinces by the 1830s was for responsible government. Give the elected assemblies real power to govern.
So these rebellions, even though they were put down, they clearly sent a powerful message back to Britain. Who did they send out to figure out what went wrong, and what did that person recommend?
Right, to investigate, Lord Melbourne sent out Lord Durham. He was a prominent radical Whig. Now, he was only actually in Canada for a few months in 1838. But his report, published in 1839, was vitally important. It really set guidelines not just for Canada, but for the whole evolving Commonwealth. His key insight was profound. Representative government wasn't enough to keep colonists loyal. They needed responsible government, otherwise you risked a Canadian War of Independence. He argued for reuniting the two Canadas, though he kind of mistakenly hoped this would lead to the French assimilating. Now, his most radical ideas got rejected at first, but most of his other suggestions. They formed the basis of the Canada Act of 1840.
Okay, the Canada Act in 1840 reunited Upper and Lower Canada, but you mentioned the elected assembly still had very little power. So how did Canada finally get genuine, responsible government?
That's where Lord Elgin comes in. He was Durham's son-in-law, actually, arrived as Governor-General in 1847, a liberal Scotsman, and he struck this groundbreaking deal. Basically, as long as the connection with Britain was kept, he'd accept laws proposed by the Assembly. That simple agreement effectively granted responsible government to Canada. And it worked so well that Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, they all followed suit pretty quickly.
Interesting. But beyond the internal stuff, Canada always had this tricky relationship with the USA. How did that dynamic, that powerful neighbor, shape Canada's push towards unity?
Oh, it was a constant shadow. Ever since the U.S. was born, often hostile, Canadians had real fears about their undefended borders. The War of 1812-14, when U.S. forces attacked Canada, bombed the Upper Canada Assembly Building. That was a stark reminder. Commercial rivalry was fierce, too. Americans opened the Erie Canal in 1825, threatening St. Lawrence trade. So Canadians hit back with their own successful Welland Canal. Frontier disputes were also a big deal, though the Oregon Treaty in 1846, setting the boundary along the 49th parallel, that was definitely an advantage for Canada. Made sure Vancouver Island stayed Canadian.
So you've got internal grievances, the American pressure, economic needs. It sounds like all these things kind of came together in this urgent push for federation, leading to the Dominion of Canada in 1867. What were the specific drivers pushing for that big step?
Yeah, several motives really converged. Remember, Lord Durham hoped the French Canadians would assimilate? Didn't happen. They got more determined to keep their culture as English speakers flooded in. So the French Canadians saw federation not as merging, but actually as a way to protect their culture. Kind of counterintuitive, maybe, using a bigger union to guarantee local distinctiveness by separating Upper and Lower Canada again. Then there was the urgent need for that intercolonial railway linking Halifax to Quebec, critical for trade and defense. But London offered very little support. That convinced the colonies that only a united British North America could actually build it. Economic problems were a factor too. Britain moving to free trade hurt Canadian timber exports. And the American Civil War, 1861-65, that really messed with Canadian trade. It just drove home that closer cooperation between the provinces was vital for survival.
And that American Civil War, it wasn't just economics, was it? It sounds like it gave a real push on the defense side, too.
Absolutely. The Civil War brought Britain and the northern U.S. states really close to war, and it starkly highlighted how vulnerable British troops were. They actually had to travel by sleigh through New Brunswick just to get to Quebec. That convinced the British government united defense and that intercolonial railway were urgent needs. And then you had the Fenian attacks from the U.S. in 1866, adding to the urgency. All this renewed talk led directly to the British North America Act in 1867.
And the result was the Dominion of Canada.
Yes. Upper and Lower Canada were separated again, becoming Ontario and Quebec. They joined New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to form the Dominion of Canada. The act set things up so other provinces could join later, which they did, eventually stretching right across the continent. Newfoundland was the last, way later in 1949. Each province kept its own parliament for local stuff, while a federal parliament in the new capital, Ottawa, handled things like defense, overseas trade, national issues, and the name Dominion. Apparently, Kingdom of Canada wasn't popular, so they took inspiration from Psalm 72. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea.
Right. And after 1867, Canada kept developing fast under Sir John A. Macdonald, its first prime minister. What were the key developments and maybe some of the bumps in the road?
Yeah, Macdonald was central to drafting the 67 Act, and he guided the new country pretty effectively. The Intercolonial Railway got finished in 1876, and then the big one, the Canadian Pacific Railway, linking Montreal to Vancouver, finished in 1885. That opened up huge wheat farming potential in the West. But there was a challenging episode, the Louis-Riel rebellions in 1869 and 85. Riel was a Mettis leader. He was hanged after the Second Rebellion, and that reawakened much of the resentment between French and British and helped to keep alive Quebec nationalism. Definitely a painful chapter. Economically, Macdonald pushed Canadian industries with protective tariffs against U.S. goods, and the link with Britain stayed strong. Canada sent troops to the Boer War, and then, remarkably, 650,000 troops to World War I.
Wow. Okay, from the vast north of Canada, let's journey south, way south, to the sun-drenched continent of Australia. Its path to Dominion status started very differently, didn't it? Tied up with its origins as a penal colony.
That's right. The first European settlers were convicts, about 750 of them, arriving at Botany Bay in 1788 under Captain Arthur Phillip. That established New South Wales. Of course, Australia was already home to Indigenous Australians, the Aborigines. Their population was likely far larger than early estimates suggested. The initial European settlement at Port Jackson, soon called Sydney, well, the early years were pretty violent. Convict transportation to New South Wales mostly stopped by 1840, though some penal settlements lasted into the late 1860s.
So, leaving aside the penal origins for a moment, what were the economic engines that really powered Australia's early growth and prosperity?
Two main things really stand out. First, sheep farming. It became incredibly important. Spanish merino sheep, introduced by Captain John MacArthur around 1796, combined with discovering huge pasture lands beyond the Blue Mountains. That led to rapid expansion. By 1850, Australia was actually the world's largest wool exporter.
Wow, number one.
Yeah. The second big driver was gold. First found at Bathurst in New South Wales in 1851. Then soon after at Ballarat and Bendigo in Victoria, which had just separated from NSW, Victoria turned out to have the biggest deposits. That sparked a frantic rush of immigrants. Something like 84,000 arrived in just 1852 alone. Huge numbers.
Incredible. Now, beyond New South Wales and Victoria, there were other Australian colonies popping up, each with its own story. Can you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. Tasmania, founded 1803, was a penal settlement known for treating Aborigines particularly brutally, tragically leading to their demise there. Victoria started as a sheep settlement near Melbourne in 1835, grew really fast, and split from NSW in 1850. South Australia, founded 1836, was different, focused on free settlers. Queensland began as a place to dump convicts but became separate in 1859. Western Australia, founded 1829, grew slowly until major gold discoveries at Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie in the 1890s really kicked things off there.
Let's circle back to Edward Gibbon Wakefield. His name keeps coming up. What's so different about his ideas for colonization, and how do they actually work out in a place like South Australia?
Right, Wakefield. Despite a, shall we say, colorful past involving kidnapping, he developed this theory of organized colonization. His main idea, laid out in his 1829 letter from Sydney, was that land in Australia was just too cheap and labor too scarce. Bad combination. He proposed the government sell land at a sufficient price, high enough so only, responsible people bought manageable chunks. The money raised would then pay for immigrants to come over. They'd work as laborers until they could afford their own land. It was meant to be a self-sustaining system, getting rid of the need for convicts. And his ideas did gain influence. They played a part in stopping convict transport to NSW by 1840.
So his ideas had impact. But what about his own attempt to found a colony based on this system? How did that go?
Wakefield himself pushed to found a colony. which led to the South Australia Association and the first settlers arriving in 1836. But, well, starting a colony from scratch purely on his system turned out to be tricky. The government offered zero financial help. It all relied on land sales. But the initial price was set too high, didn't attract enough buyers. South Australia was actually saved from disaster by outside financial help, but it did eventually thrive, becoming the granary of Australia thanks to wheat and copper discoveries. So while its success wasn't just down to Wakefield, his ideas definitely provided the initial spark.
Australia's political path seems a bit smoother than Canada's, but eventually the separate colonies did move towards becoming a united Australia in 1901. What finally pushed them towards federation?
You're right, they got responsible government without the same kind of big struggles Canada had. Most colonies had it by 1859. And for years, honestly, there was little interest in federation. Communication between the 6 colonies was poor, they developed quite separately. Serious talks only really started after 1890. But then, 3 key things pushed them together. First, external threats became a real worry. German ambitions in the Pacific, Japanese ambitions too. Japan decisively beating China in 1894 really hammered home the need for a strong and united defense to deter any foreign moves on Australia.
So a feeling of vulnerability. What about money? Economic factors.
Oh, huge factor. The early 1890s saw a terrible economic crisis. It peaked with the 1893 bank panic, which was a profound shock for Australians. Widespread unemployment. That crisis, plus drought and falling wool prices, you could argue that was the main driver for federation. Unity would get rid of those troublesome customs barriers between the states, and it would boost confidence, make it easier to borrow money from overseas. And finally, just practically, improved communications made it feasible. The main cities were linked by rail between 1883 and 1889. Federation actually felt possible now. So all that led to the Commonwealth of Australia Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1900, started operating January 1st, 1901. The federal parliament got control over defense, foreign policy, trade, immigration, everything else. Social services, education, health stayed with the state parliaments. They actually kept more power than their Canadian counterparts. And to avoid arguments about which city should be capital, they decided to build a brand new one, Canberra, located between Sydney and Melbourne. A classic compromise.
A very Australian solution. And what were some of the key developments for this new Commonwealth of Australia in those early years after 1901?
Yeah, the new country found its feet. By 1914, federal policies had pretty much stabilized the economy. Some important early laws included the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. That effectively created the White Australia policy. It was driven by fears of low-wage Asian and Pacific workers undercutting wages, but also, deeper down, a fear of being swamped by unrestricted immigration. Australia also brought in an arbitration court in 1904. Its job was to set fair and reasonable wages and mediate industrial disputes. And its decisions were binding, pretty novel for the time. They also brought in social welfare stuff, old age pensions, maternity allowances. And on the defense front, conscription came in 1911, and the first ships for the Australian Navy launched in 1913. And like Canada, Australia played a big role in World War I, sending over 300,000 troops to Europe.
Okay, our final stop on this historical journey takes us across the Tasman Sea to the beautiful islands of New Zealand. Another British dominion, but with its own distinct story, particularly around its indigenous Maori population.
That's right. When Europeans first arrived, New Zealand was home to the Maori, a Polynesian people. Captain James Cook mapped the islands, claimed them for Britain in 1769. But large-scale colonization didn't really happen until the 19th century. Early Europeans were mostly missionaries, whalers, some escaped convicts from Australia, too.
And our friend Edward Gibbon Wakefield pops up again here, doesn't he?
He does indeed. After his South Australia venture, Wakefield formed the New Zealand Association in 1837. He led the first organized group of settlers, about 1,200 people, establishing places like Wellington and Nelson. The British government officially annexed the colony, just in the nick of time, actually stopping a French colonizing party that was on its way. And that set the scene for the really crucial Treaty of Waitangi.
The Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. That sounds like a really foundational moment for New Zealand's history, and especially its relationship with the Maori. What did it actually say?
It was hugely significant. Signed by Governor William Hobson with Maori chiefs, mostly from the North Island. Essentially, the Maori recognized Queen Victoria as their sovereign. In return, the British guaranteed the Maori possession of their lands. And crucially, the British government became the only buyer allowed for any Maori land put up for sale, and only if the whole tribe agreed. The idea was to prevent dodgy land deals and exploitation.
But as we know, treaties, even with good intentions, often run into problems on the ground. What happened right after Waitangi was signed?
Tragically, yes. Many settlers and even officials from Wakefield's company just flat out broke the treaty. Maoris ended up being evicted from their lands. This led to fighting, spasmodic fighting, as Lowe calls it, sometimes known as the First Maori War from 1842 to 46. By 1845, the whole colony was really struggling. Not a success, plagued by conflict, development stalled.
Sounds like a really difficult start. But then a new governor arrived who seems to have managed things very differently, at least for a while. Sir George Grey. What was his approach?
Sir George Grey, yeah, became governor in 1845, only 33, but already had a reputation for getting things done. He first subdued the Maori, mainly by showing military strength, but then he showed great sympathy and understanding. He even learned the Maori language. He stopped private land sales. He negotiated the purchase of almost all of the South Island where very few Maoris actually lived. And he spent money on schools, hospitals, farming advice. That helped farmers, both Maori and settlers, become prosperous.
So things improved. But as more settlers arrived, the demand for self-government grew louder, just like elsewhere. How did New Zealand make that move towards a unified self-governing state?
Yeah, as settler numbers climbed, they campaigned for self-government. The first big step was the New Zealand Federation, set up by a British Act of Parliament in 1852. This gave the 6 main settlements their own elected councils, plus a central federal assembly, and full responsible self-government where the governor wasn't ultimately in charge anymore. That was granted in 1856.
But despite achieving self-government, it seems relations with the Maori got worse again, leading to more war. What caused that breakdown and what happened?
Yeah, sadly. After 1856, there was this huge influx of new settlers. Population jumped from maybe 60,000 to 350,000 by 1878. This created tremendous pressure for land. Settlements started pushing into the Maori interior, areas previously left alone. This led to what Lowe calls the final desperate defense by the Maoris, the Second Maori War, from 1860 to 1871. The Maoris fought incredibly bravely, but European military power just meant there was no chance of a Maori victory. Sir George Grey actually came back for a second term as governor during this time, but with self-government in place, he had very little power compared to before. Still, some concessions were made. Maoris got representation in the Federal Assembly from 1867. An agreement was reached for them to live undisturbed in about a third of the North Island. But, the fact remained that the Maoris had been deprived of much of their most fertile land, sometimes by purchase, but more often by straightforward confiscation. That's the hard reality.
So even with representation, a huge amount was lost. What about New Zealand's political structure? It didn't stay federal, did it? It moved to a single parliament.
Correct. In the early 1870s, leading politicians like Julius Vogel argued the provincial assemblies were just inefficient, so they were abolished, and a single parliament in Wellington was created in 1876. Economically, New Zealand went through a tough patch until the mid-1890s. Then things picked up. Food and wool prices recovered. Farmers really prospered right through World War I, largely thanks to the development of refrigerator ships. Suddenly, they could export lamb all the way to Britain. Big game changer.
New Zealand also really made a name for itself with some pretty remarkable reforms around the turn of the century. Quite progressive stuff for the time.
Indeed. Richard John Seddon's Liberal governments from 1893 to 1906 brought in some major changes. Votes for women in 1893 way ahead of many countries. Old age pensions, cheap government loans for farmers, better working conditions, and a system of compulsory arbitration of industrial disputes. Lowe notes New Zealand was the first country in the world to have a system like that. And like the others, New Zealand played a huge part in WWI. A remarkably high proportion of its population served. About 100,000 men went overseas, famously distinguishing themselves at Gallipoli in 1915.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We've traced these distinct paths, haven't we? Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Separate colonies evolving into self-governing dominions, sometimes parallel paths, sometimes very different. We've seen the forces pushing them, internal demands for self-rule, external threats making them unite, economic needs driving development. And yeah, that shifting British imperial policy trying to keep up.
Yeah, and if you step back and look at the bigger picture, it really shows how, adaptable the British Empire could be, but also the growing agency, the power of these emerging nations. Each one faced unique hurdles, didn't they? French-English relations and that huge neighbor for Canada, the convict origins, and just the sheer scale of Australia, the intense Maori conflicts in New Zealand. Yet somehow they all ended up on a similar path towards more and more autonomy, often pushing the boundaries further than London initially intended, I think.
So what does all this mean
for you listening now?
Well, understanding these foundations, I think it really sheds light on modern national identities, political system, even international relationships today. The choices made back then, the compromises struck, the conflicts fought, they all kind of echo in the fabric of these nations still. It definitely raises an important question, doesn't it? How do those differing experiences, the degree of internal struggle, the external pressures, and especially how indigenous populations were treated, how does all that shape the long-term national character and the ongoing conversations within these former colonies, even now, over a century later?
It's a powerful thought to leave you with. How do those early decisions and the way they played out continue to resonate in the societies we see around us today? Something for you to maybe explore further on your own deep dive.